Hello guys, welcome to another virtual biology lesson. Last week we have been talking about mosses, which are specific plants that don't quite resemble plants because they don't create organs typical for plants. And today we are going to follow this path of plants that reproduce using spores. And today we're going to talk about pteridophytes. Po polsku paprotniki. Pteridophytes, similarly to mosses, can be met in dark and damp places. So environment of living, dark, damp places, such as forest floor. They also can be found on the banks of lakes and rivers. Some are also common inhabitants of meadows and farmlands. So some live on banks of bodies of water. Some live on meadows and farmlands. And guys, pteridophytes, they create roots, stems, and leaves. They are better adapted to living on land compared to mosses, and there are three types of pteridophytes. And those are ferns, paprocie, those are horsetails, skrzypy, and those are lycophytes, or lycopods, widłaki. What they have in common is that they have usually two types of leaves. One of them is responsible for photosynthesis, just like in the case of most of the plants. The second type of leaves, is used only to house sporangiums. Sporangiums are the organs that create spores, from which the spores are later released. And guys, here is a diagram presenting a fern. This is what the fern looks like, and let's focus on those characteristic elements. First of all, this part that is here, it's below the ground and it's used for asexual reproduction, but also storing nutrients. This part is rhizome. Po polsku kłącze. But also, this rhizome, just like in other plants, like in ginger or any other plants that create rhizomes, we have thin and numerous roots. And roots serve the same purpose as in most of the plants, where basically they are here to support the plant, to keep it in soil, and to take water with mineral salts from the soil. What is characteristic is that young leaves, they look like snails' shells. Here we have also this. So basically they unwind just like a roll. So young leaves look like snail's shell. On the bottom sides of mature leaves, there are sporangiums. So here we have the front side of the leaf here, but here is the bottom side of the leaf. And here, that brown thing is sporangium. Zarodnia. So this is the place where spores develop and from which they are later released. I have a picture of that later. Okay, guys, so this is a fern. This is what a fern looks like. So let's move on to the second group, which are horsetails. And here we have an example of a horsetail. Jeszcze raz po polsku skrzyp. Basically, they have two types of shoots. The brown one is called the spring shoot, czyli pęd wiosenny. What is significant about this is the fact that the spring shoot has the sporangium on its top. That means that lots of spores are being stored at the top of this shoot, and later, when they are mature, they are released. No chlorophyll is present in here because what it does, its only task is to create and release the spores. No photosynthesis is happening here, so all the nutrients and all the energy needed for this is taken from this part, which is the rhizome. But as it says, it's spring shot, so it happens at the beginning of the spring, it happens in the spring, but once all the nutrients are being used for creating spores, new nutrients need to be made in order to survive another year, and this happens with the green summer shot. It doesn't contain any sporangium, it contains reduced leaves. And in those leaves there is chlorophyll, so photosynthesis can occur, and while it occurs, it creates nutrients that are later being sent down to the rhizome, from which next spring the horsetail will release spring shoots that will release the spores. And the last group are lycopods, widłaki. And they look a little bit like mosses. Their stem lays on the ground, maybe I will pick another color. Their stem lays on the ground, and from which vertical stems are emerging. And guys, here are tiny leaves, and those are actual leaves. here those parts are also sporangiums from which the uh, spores are being released. And they also have roots below the ground. So guys, what they all have in common is the fact that they have leaves. Here we have a leaf, here we have the reduced leaves, but they are still leaves. They also have sporangiums, which is, in this case, here, in the case of a horsetail, it grows on the top of spring shoots, and sporangiums, in case of ferns, can be found in a form of tiny dots on the backside of fern's leaf. Life cycle of a fern is complicated because they don't use a really resource consuming way of creating seeds. They had to think of something simpler, but in reality, it turned out to be even more complicated than just a seed. So let's follow it from the very beginning. Mature plant releases spores here. The spore then falls on the ground and immediately starts to germinate, kiełkuje. Once the spore germinates, it doesn't grow straight to the point where it's a tiny fern, but from this spore, heart-shaped plant is growing, and this is called protalium. Czyli po polsku przedrośle. And guys, protalium contains cells producing eggs and sperm. Sperm reaches eggs through a drop of water, just like in the case of mosses. So, a drop of water needs to be here in order to transport sperm from male cell to female cell. And new fern finally emerges from this protalium. Protalium dies at this point, and then the fern as an adult is ready to sprout and to thrive, and eventually is able to create sporangiums. This is what it looks like on a fern. Those tiny dots are sporangiums. If you take it when it's mature and brown and put it, for instance, on a damp piece of paper towel, the protalium should grow. So from this point, you can basically put it onto the soil, and this is the way you can grow a new fern. Okay, guys, so let's talk a little bit about of significance of them. In the past, they were a huge thing. And by the past, I mean over 200 million years ago. That's first. And I mean seriously huge thing. They used to grow up to 40 meters tall. There were no trees as we know them nowadays. There were only huge ferns, gigantic horsetails, but they went extinct. Well, those giants, Pteridophytes, they just went extinct due to a climate change. But what is left after them is the fact that due to a very specific climate and very specific lack of microorganisms capable of decomposing them, the remains of those horsetails and lycopods and ferns, they were covered by the layers of dust and then compressed, and they turned into coal. Some scientists say that nowadays it's impossible for the coal to form because many new microorganisms that weren't alive at this time, uh, they would prevent the coal from forming. They would instead decompose it. So once we have used all the coal resources that we have, there will be no coal left. So we have first significance is that they are the source of coal. The remains were transformed into coal sources. Nowadays, they are part of forest undergrowth and create habitat for small animals. Of course, just like in many other cases, they are a part of food chain, of various food chains basically. If it comes to lycopods, if it comes to horsetails, they are used in medicine and they have been used in medicine for a long time because it turns out that the horsetails uh, extract can be really helpful in curing problems connected with hair falling out, nails breaking, so they are a source of medicine. Not only natural medicine, not only the old one that our grandmothers used to do, but also their impact is scientifically proven. They are also, especially the ferns, they are kept in gardens and pots at home because they just look kind of cool. Now the ferns are coming back to our houses because in the past they were really, really popular. They were absolutely everywhere. Around 2000s, they have disappeared somehow because they went out of fashion and now they are back to it. But sometimes ferns can become a really unwanted guests because they develop quickly and they have rhizomes, which makes them difficult to get rid of. So sometimes they can be unwanted weeds. Unwanted weeds. Basically, the problem with them is the fact that they don't create seeds. As I mentioned while talking about mosses, when a seed of an apple is falling down somewhere, if it's too dry, then basically it will not germinate. The seed will be able to wait for the better weather conditions. But spores don't have these features. Spores will start to germinate immediately after they have got just a little bit of water. And basically, in most of the cases, they will die in the process. Another fact that limits the Meaning, the significance of ferns nowadays is the fact that in order to reproduce, they have to have water, they have to have dark and humid spaces, which basically makes it much more difficult in open spaces. Okay, guys, so three types of pteridophytes, lycopods, horsetails, and ferns. Here is what a fern looks like. Here is the horsetail with its two types of shoots. And here is the lycopod, which basically resembles moss a little bit, except for this part, except for the sporangium. The life cycle is complicated and it basically requires two phases. So the first phase is there for the protelium to grow, and then only from the protelium it will, and the new plant will emerge. This is what sporangium looks like, just those tiny things on the bottom side of the leaves. And here is the significance for the ecological system. Okay, guys, this is it for now. Thanks for your attention.